Good afternoon, dear colleagues. We shall start the broadcast now. Good afternoon once again, dear colleagues and guests. Today is the 16th of September 2021, 2:01 Moscow time. At the meeting of the Dissertation Council for the Defense of the Dissertation by Nigmatullina Kamilla Nigmatullina for the degree of Doctor of Political Sciences in Scientific Specialty 01-10 Journalism on the topic Professional Journalism Culture in Modern Russia considered open. By the order of Academic Secretary, St. Petersburg State University, Knotov Alexander Valentinovich, number 4814/1, Dmitry Petrovich Kopra, Doctor of Theology, Professor, Head of the Department of Public Relationship and Business at Petersburg State University, was appointed Chairman of the Dissertation Council. The same order approved the members of the Dissertation Council. Let me introduce them. Plekin Igor Nikolaevich, Doctor of Political Sciences, Associate Professor, Professor of the Department of Theory of Journalism and Mass Communications at Petersburg State University. Bykov Ilya Anatolyevich, Doctor of Political Sciences, Associate Professor, Professor of the Institute of Higher School of Journalism and Mass Communications at Petersburg State University. Elchinkovsky Nikolaevich, Doctor of Philology, Associate Professor, Professor of the Institute of the Higher School of Journalism and Mass Communications at Petersburg State University. In the remote access mode, the Dissertation Council meeting is attended by Vatanovna Yolanta Leonidovna, Academician of the Russian Academy of Education, Doctor of Philology, Head of the Department of Theory and Economics of Mass Media, Dean of the Faculty of Journalism, alumnus of Moscow State University. Can you see and hear us? The answer is positive. We're happy to see you. Likewise. Vladimir Fedorovich, Doctor of Philosophy, Professor, Head of the Department of Periodicals and Network Publications of the Ural Federal University, named after the first President of Russia, Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin. Can you see and hear us, Boris Fedorovich? The answer is yes. Gregory John Simons, PhD in Philology, Center for Eurasian and Russian Studies, Uppsala University, Sweden. Can you see and hear us?
Yes.
Thank you, we're glad to see you. The applicant is also present with us, which is obvious. Nigmatullina Kamilla Nigmatullina. So the meeting of the Dissertation Council in the remote access mode is the scientific advisor of the applicant, Bujanova Svetlana Sergeyevna, Doctor of Political Sciences, Professor of the Department of Mass Communication Management at Petersburg State University. Good afternoon, Svetlana Sergeyevna. I can see and hear everyone well. Very happy to see you all. In order to improve the quality of communication, I ask you, dear colleagues who are in the remote access mode, to turn off your microphones, but do not forget to turn them on when you're given the floor.
Также прошу всех коллег выключить мобильные телефоны.
I would also like all the colleagues to turn off their mobile phones. I'd like to inform you that audio video recording of our meetings is being conducted and live broadcasts on the St. Petersburg State University website. Simultaneous translation is being carried out. On the screen of the live broadcast of the meeting of the Council, an email is currently indicated where during the meeting all listeners can send questions to the applicant or express their opinions concerning the content of the academic thesis, the presentation of the applicant, the current scientific discussion, and thus take part in scientific discussions. These questions will be sent to me by the technical services, and I will voice them during the discussion. Questions should be directly related to the applicant's presentation and the content of the academic thesis. It's obligatory to indicate the name, position, place of work of the author of the question. Questions not related to scientific discussion of the presentation, text, and evaluation of the academic thesis itself, as well as anonymous questions, will not be voiced. In accordance with the procedure of awarding the academic degree of Quantitative Sciences, the academic degree of Doctor of Sciences, Petersburg State University, approved by the local regulatory acts of St. Petersburg State University, hereinafter procedure, our Dissertation Council is valid if at least 2/3 of the approved membership take place. That is not less than 4 people. Our council consists of 7 people. All 7 are present, including 3 council members in remote access mode with audio-visual content provided. Thus, there is a quorum. I'll simply of the Department of Supporting the Activities of the Dissertation Council issue the turnout list. I establish the following rules of procedure for today's meeting of the Dissertation Council with a total duration of approximately 3 hours. 1. Brief information of the chairman about the applicant and the documents submitted by the applicant for scientific degree and their compliance with established requirements. Answers to possible questions, about 5 minutes. 2. Short presentation of the applicant. Short presentation, I'd like to stress. For scientific degree, reflected the main research provisions, approximately 15 minutes. Questions to the applicant, strictly according to the presentation, no more than 2 minutes per questions. Answer of the applicant, no more than 5 minutes for everything. 5. Speeches of all members of the Dissertation Council alternately with the assessment of the dissertation research and the performance of the applicant, as well as with questions and suggestions and comments to the academic thesis. 6. Speeches by the chairman with the assessment of the thesis. 7. Answers of the applicant for scientific degree to the questions and comments of the members of the Dissertation Council, no more than 20 minutes. 8. Open discussion. Speeches at the request of those present at the defense of the dissertation with a summary of the positions and or with specific questions or proposal for the dissertation strictly on the topic of research. No more than 2 minutes per person. At the same time, we'll ask all those who wish to participate to sign in the turnout list. 9. Presentation by the chairman of questions addressed to the applicant received during the discussion of the scientific discussion and the process of presentation of the report. I'd like to draw attention to the fact that written question, the announcement of which takes more than 2 minutes, will not be voiced. Answers of the applicant in more than 2 minutes. 11. Speech by scientific advisor of the applicant in more than 3 minutes. 12. Discussion by the members of the Dissertation Council before the open vote of the result of the defense, during which the sound of the broadcast is muted. About 5 minutes. 13. Open roll call. Counting of votes by the chairman of the Dissertation Council with subsequent entry of the result in the minutes of the meeting. 14. Making a decision on awarding or not awarding the academic degree. 15. Concluding remarks of the applicant, no more than 2 minutes. Dear colleagues, are there any questions or objections to the regulations? If there are no objections, I proceed to the implementations of the rules of procedure. First of all, please turn off the sound of your mobile phones. Dear colleagues and who are in remote access mode, please do not turn off the phones for prompt communication with you in the event of a technical failure. Thank you for your understanding. Shall we have any technical difficulties, we'll announce technical break. So I'm starting the meeting. The dissertation of Nigmatullina Kamilla Nigmatullina for the degree of Doctor of Political Sciences in the scientific specialty 11010 Journalism on the topic of professional journalism culture in modern Russia was accepted for defense by order of the scientific secretaries in Budapest State University number 3554/1. Nigmatullina Kamilla Nigmatullina wrote the thesis research on the basis in Budapest State University. The scientific consultant is Svetlana Sergeyevna Butunova, Doctor of Political Sciences, Professor for the Department of Mass Communication Management at Budapest State University. The number of publications of the applicant, which the main scientific provisions of the thesis are stated according to the list presented, 19. In peer-reviewed scientific publications from the list approved by the Ministry of Education and Sciences, 7. In publication in the Scienometric databases work with Science and Scopus, 11 publications. The applicant submitted to the Government Secretaries in Budapest State University a complete package of documents for acceptance for consideration and defense of the thesis. All documents correspond to Clause 12 of Section 3 of the procedure. All documents submitted by the applicant, information I received from the curator, meet the requirements and are stored in the applicant certification file. Copies of them are also in the possession of an employee of the Department for Support of the Dissertation Council, who is now attending the meeting. Before giving the floor to the applicant, I have a question to the members of the Dissertation Council. Dear members of the Dissertation Council, do you have any general questions to the applicant, including whether there is a need to announce the entire list of documents submitted by the applicant for defense? Thank you, there are no questions, and there is no such need. Then I give the floor to Kamilla Nigmatullina. Good afternoon, dear colleagues, chairman and members of the Dissertation Council, and guests. I'd like to present the academic thesis devoted to the professional culture of journalists in modern Russia. Discussion about the transformation of the profession of a journalist in modern history of Russia occupies an important place, not only in the academic and professional space, but also in the public field. Today, not a single conversation about journalism is complete without discussion about the mission of journalism in modern society, about the purpose of the profession and the global impact of digital transformation on the essence of journalism. The loss of a monopoly on information has led to the fact that these conversations arise more and more often. Why do we need journalists in the era of social networks and artificial intelligence? The need for professional mediation in the production and delivery of socially significant information was especially important during the pandemic, when millions of people turned to media for information and emotional support. For researchers, it means an increased interest to such a professional culture of journalists, which contributes to a harmonious relationship between the authorities, society, and journalists. Another important issue is the decline of the overall level of trust to journalists and journalism. Thus, the relevance of considering journalistic culture is directly related to the shift in the boundaries of the profession and an intense discussion in the professional community and society as a whole about the purpose of journalism in the place of media communication, digital platforms, and changing media consumption. The study of the profession of a journalist has accompanied the formation of profession itself over the past 100 years in Russia and in the world. Over the past 20 years, research interest to the new frontiers of journalism and how to define them has grown significantly. The scientific novelty of the thesis is associated with a comprehensive study of the theoretical foundation for understanding professional journalistic culture and convergence of domestic and foreign approaches. This is especially important today for Russian science, which seeks to find its own voice in the global community and take into account the achievements of the world community at the same time. The definition of journalism culture in English-speaking studies and professional culture of a journalist in a Russian-speaking culture are similar in that they rely on the concept of ideology, identity, set of values and practices. The definitions of Russian researchers also mention knowledge, skills, moral and ethical standards. The author's research is based on a set of three key parameters of journalism culture: conceptualization, these are norms, rules, standard, and mission; the implementation of professional practice, these are rules, function, ideology, autonomy; and journalistic works, that is the result of the activities that reflect professional ideas, values, and rules. The process of fragmentation in journalism and the characterization of the fragmentation of journalistic culture also became the prerequisites of the study. They indicate the presence of specific groups of values and ideologies within a single professional community. The emergence of these groups is due to differences in the understanding of professional ideology and differences in professional identity of cultural bearers. In this work, we proceed from methodology of already conducted cross-cultural studies in which the Russian case was present. At least two projects are ongoing today. These are Worlds of Journalism and Effectiveness of the Journalistic Role. They were attended by colleagues from Russian universities. In one of the projects, Challenge of the BRICS countries, the author of the thesis participated as a researcher. Also, major sociological studies and private studies in Russian regions were analyzed. Many similarities were found in the methods of analysis and approaches to addressing the problem, but the question remained about unifying theoretical framework that would allow reaching the next level of generalization of conclusions. In general, the history of the study of journalistic culture has undergone several waves. First, it was the study of national context, then the study of global context and comparative perspective, and finally, today it's again the study of national context in the global perspective. This work is carried out in line with the third wave, in which the focus of research is directed to the concept of hybridity, that is, fragmentation of journalism in the global information ecology. On this slide you see the key works related to the subject of research. The starting point in the work was the actor network analysis and the concept discussive institutionalism as interpreted by Voss and Hanich, as well as critical discourse analyzed and interpreted by Van Dyck and Verklo, comparative analysis of the media system and the comparative analysis of journalistic cultures as interpreted by Miada and Hanich and their co-authors. Actor network analysis made it possible to present the journalistic community in the work as a network of actors with their own hierarchies and rules of interactions. In the process of interaction, fact and journalist culture is transformed. It is discursive and can be fixed through the study of the interactors. Discussive institutionalism is a branch of neo-institutionalism which studies ideas and discourse in an institutional context. This approach allows us to combine the study of the individual roles of journalists and function of journalism as an institution. The discursive turn in the study of journalistic culture is caused, among other things, by the speed of changes in professional practice and the inability to describe a universal model of the profession. The depth of the study covers a period of 20 years. The author's empirical research has been carried out since 2016 and continues to the present, with the emphasis on regional journalism. Fragments of the author's empirical analysis in 2011-2013 were also used. In general, the method is the study of conversations, surveys, interviews, documents, and texts in a wide context, limited only by the language framework. A critical component of the analysis of professional discourse includes identifying dominant ideas and concepts, as well as the actors who promote the ideas. Journalistic culture as a dynamic and discursive object is fixed in the categories of discourse and can be studied at the following levels. The first level examines the professional roles of journalists as a concept, the peculiarities of understanding self-censorship, that is, individual limitations, in professional discourse, as well as differences in understanding the consequences or deprofessionalization and other relevant processes. The second level examines regional local differences in discourse and conversations about journalism. Reconstruction of professional identity occurs through the analysis of the practices of other journalists in comparison with their own. At the third level, the reconstruction of professional identity occurs through the correlation of professional practices with the conceptualization of the profession at the level of social expectations and demands. At the fourth level, the concept of discourse are correlated in the space of different coordinates and represent a multidimensional mapping of the Russian discourse about the profession. Let's move on to the results of the study. In the presented academic thesis, the set goals achieved. The key characteristics of the professional culture of journalists in Russia by the end of the second decade of the 21st century are determined. The dominant journalistic groups within the professional community are described. The boundaries of the professional discourse on journalism that determine the professional standards and values of modern Russian journalism are identified. On this slide, you can see a fragment of a survey of journalists. I will list the main results obtained in the course of quantitative and qualitative analysis. Journalists continue to reflect on the Soviet and post-Soviet experience, but the discourse of the professional community today is formed from views on the future development of transformation of the institution of journalism. Understanding the current mission of journalism depends on the nature of thinking about political, economic, and technological transformations over the past 20 years. This part is the most obvious and formed part of the public discourse about the profession. Understanding the autonomy of journalism is based on a mixture of external factors, editorial pressure, and internal constraints. Self-censorship today is linked to the corporate interest in the media. Understanding the limitations in the profession is an insufficiently explicit and formed part of the public discourse about the profession. Understanding the ethical principles of journalism lies in the intersection of normativity and situational awareness. The standards and ideas of textbooks and policy statements do not correspond to actual practice. This reflected is in general ethical relativism and is an important and shaped part of public discourse about the profession. In this slide, you can see a fragment of an in-depth interview. Contemporary Russian journalists recognize the importance of the principle of impartiality, but in practice advocate the implementation of a humanitarian approach. Journalists are ready to provide the audience with interesting information, but at the same time they do not believe that the interests of the audience are sufficiently diverse. Journalists consider the role that influence of public opinion to be significant. Most of them assert the need for a certain position in interpretation of information. However, there are discrepancies regarding the concept of the fourth estate. It is recognized in the abstract but not confirmed in practice. In the professional community, the line between journalism and social activism has not been found. The degree of admissibility of activism and its forms haven't been determined. The formulation of a professional role is always relative. It cannot reflect the whole variety of manifestations of journalistic culture. Russian journalists generally support the high standards of West journalism and general polls, but in detailed interviews they're skeptical about the proposed formulations. the slide you can see the piece of content analysis. In understanding the values of the profession, one can find coexistence of two paradigms, public service and commercial interests of the media. Polarizing for the professional community, for example, is the attitude towards the need for state support of the media, in particular of regional print press. Russian journalists tend to make decisions on a situational basis, based on personal conviction or editorial dogma, including decisions about social media activity. There is no uniform practice of differentiating professional and individual identities in the space of social digital platforms. In general, journalists recognize the need for natural professional restrictions and practices of self-censorship. Contradictions in the understanding of self-censorship have also been recorded. For example, the concept of adherence to professional standards and pressure on journalists in connection with professional activities are confused. Journalists are characterized by dual understanding of objectivism, at the absence of subjectivism and the presence of a single picture of reality, linking objectivity with the liberal position of the media and Western settings of journalism. The author reveals an ambiguous attitude toward the concept of autonomy of journalism due to historically established media system, which excludes the form of public media. The opposition of ideas of dependence and corporate interest in independence from the ideological position of the owner was recorded. It can be stated that there is an increasing number of specialists with specialized education, and at the same time there is the low authority of specialized education in the market and discrepancy between this discourse of textbooks and real practice. In discourse, this is suppressed by the opposition of ideas about the necessity or the redundancy of professional education. The polarization in the pale truth, in fact, is increasing in the context of growing distrust of the media and difficulty of filtering inaccurate messages. The journalist becomes a verifier of information, which shifts the focus from public service to craft qualifications skills. For society, the profession of a journalist remains popular but controversial in terms of its value. Journalists' understanding of the degree of self-confidence is at odds with the results of the polls. The paradox also lies in the fact that simultaneously with the fall in trust, an increase in respect for the profession was recorded. This ambiguity of public attitude towards the profession influences the feeling of uncertainty in the collective identity of journalists. To overcome the complexity of the perception of the results obtained and to establish connection between them, we use the spatial understanding of discourse. In spatial visualization, we have reflected 4 types of organization of communicative space around journalistic culture. We have placed all spatial discourses inside the public, since it is consolidating and absorbing the demand for journalism as a profession as a whole. We also understand that academic discourse is the least significant for the harmonization of the public in real life, but ideally its role should be no less important than the role of others. The most common contradiction for all types of discourse is the request to determine the ethical origins of current professional values. The most significant for the harmonization is the request to increase the level of trust to the media from the behalf of the society and the professional community. It's obvious that in order to resolve the contradiction, there is a general increase in transparency and accessibility of discourses within the framework is necessary. As a result of this study, the key characteristics of modern Russian journalist culture have been found. First, the perception of Russian journalists about the profession, its values, roles, are determined to a great extent by experience, type of media, and regional differences, to a lesser degree by age, gender, personal political views. Second, the great differences between journalists were found on regional basis. Journalism culture in rural area and national republics is more monolithic and discursively weak. Regional differences between professional groups are determined by the political and economic situation in the region, much more than by internal professional factors, including the speed of digital adaptation. Third, the journalist experiences more difficulties in situation of professional choice when moving from the level of individual identity to editorial ideology, and editorial restrictions turn out to be more definite than internal personal ones. Fourth, Russian journalists expose themselves to restriction but assess this phenomenon to a great extent as positive. Fifth, respondents consider political and legislative changes, technological transformations to be important factors in the formation of journalistic standards and values. Although in discourse, the problem of digital adaptations are reflected as the most divisive in the professional community. Sixth, Russian journalists perceive the nature of the current changes in the profession in the same way, but assess their consequence differently. At the same time, the assessment of the past experience of journalism has less influence on the discursiveness of journalistic culture than modeling the future. 7. In the discourse of Russian journalists, the uncertainty of the future of the profession is associated with the consequences of all levels of transformation. In practice, most journalists are ready for changes in their practice. However, there is no consensus on what needs to be presented as a core profession and what needs to be changed or adapted. 8. Professional discourse is polarizing in relation to understanding the audience as civil society and as consumers. There's a strong demand for the formulation of an institutional mission and for formation of a discourse aimed at uniting the journalistic community. 9th, an important contradiction of professional discourse is, firstly, the dual understanding of objectivism, and secondly, the ambiguous attitude towards the concept of autonomy. Finally, the gap between understanding the professional role and professional practice is due to the lack of constructive discussion of the results of journalistic practice and the growing importance of public media criticism on digital platforms. Thus, the discursiveness of journalistic culture manifests itself in a set of contradictions between fixed norms, shared values, dominant ideologies, and volatility of professional practices. Journalism culture is defined by differences rather than similarities. It is reflected in the dynamics of good discourse by the manifestation of clear and indefinite meanings in public and non-public spaces. The research carried out is of practical importance for the modern Russian journalistic community, since it reflects the contradictory nature of value paradigms and the conflictogenic nature of certain professional attitudes. We believe that the discussion of the results of the research on professional platforms will be able to contribute to the harmonization of professional discourse, to identify the position of the community regarding the issues of the actual mission of journalism, professional roles, autonomy, and professional ethics, to strengthen professional ideas about the foundation of value paradigms and help making professional decisions. Thank you for your attention. I'm ready to answer your questions. Thank you very much. Thank you for complying to the procedure. Dear members of the Dissertation Council, do you have any questions related to the presentation? If you do, please ask them. Then I have a question. Kamilla Nigmatullina, my question is the following. How, in the empirical sense, did you identify professional logic? How did you make it a quantitative? I studied the interviews published in mass media and in the professional media, magazine journalists, for example. These interviews were considered with the help of content analysis. The topics were identified, then the concepts were identified, the concepts which show ideological categories, showing the professional culture of journalists. That's the system of beliefs, and it had to be identified through the phrases and their qualitative analysis. Thus, we got some quantitative information on the frequency of usage, which phrases can be found in the published text, and then qualitative analysis was conducted. Professor Bykov, please, your question. Thank you very much for your report. I understand the main notions that you use, but my question is related to the terms, to one of the terms that you use. We know such terms as values, norms, but also there is a social term as attitudes and stereotypes. And in your academic thesis, you didn't use such a term as attitudes and stereotypes. Well, I found the term stereotypes twice. Well, it was not done for purpose. The terms used were linked to the general terminology used, were related to the ideas of values. We didn't discuss stereotypes, since journalists are representatives of creative sphere because they break stereotypes. Unlike budding journalists, Generally, journalists do not have well-formed stereotypes. Usually, situational practice influences, and stereotypes can be quickly found and grounded in a certain context. It's a rather important category, but it wasn't studied separately. Are there any more questions? Esteemed Kamilla Nigmatullina, discourse and discursiveness are the basic terms that you use. I think that professional journalistic culture and professional journalism culture are a bit different things, since the professional culture of a journalist is more of a philological discourse, and if we talk about journalism culture, this is a different one. Since you are applying for the degree of PhD in political sciences, what is the main idea of the political discourse? If you please, I will answer these questions when I answer the reviews, the comments and questions in the reviews. So I'll provide the answer a little bit later. I do not object to that. Thank you. Dear colleagues, any more questions related to the presentation? As a chairman, I'd like to ask one more question. A short one. You are working on the empirical part in the context on the theory of Russia's by Natalia Zubarevich. How did you find information about the fourth Russia, the Russia which cannot be attained to empirical sociologists? Svetlana Sergeyevna is laughing for she knows the answer. We are conducting the research not as individuals. We work with our masters. We always have masters who represent national republics. Thus, we get access to certain contexts at least. Well, this is a rather closed community, and very often we get rejected. Our proposals for interviews get rejected. If sometimes our questionnaires via Google Forms get answered, as for interviews, then the success rate is 1 in 10. And the rejections might be quite radical ones. There are quite unique examples when mass media work at the threshold of journalism and counter-propaganda, and they're rather closed. If there are no more questions, we move on to the second part of our work, and I would like the members of the Dissertation Council to voice the reviews. I'd propose the following order. The applicant is to answer the questions and comments to each interview. We also have 3 external reviews, and I will voice them afterwards. So we proceed, and I give the floor to Professor Blikin. Dear Chairman, dear members of the Dissertation Council, dear colleagues, the work that we are evaluating today is relevant because of a number of aspects. What I'm going to speak about is different from what Kamilla Nigmatullina said. Well, firstly, these are technological changes. Since the carrying out of journalist functions in the event of the accessibility of digital tools is not only restricted to professionals. Another aspect is related to value-based informations and the contradiction between the practice itself and the demands of the standards. The third aspect is determined by the political situation, the conflict of civilizational platforms of media systems, the strive for journalism to become a political media. And the fourth is the aspect of the economic functioning of media and their dependence on the owners and the target audience. As for the novelty, I would like to pay attention to the methodology based on the thesis of the phenomenon of multitask in the professional culture. The methodologies of the dynamics of the development of professional cultures depends on the social, political, technological environment of activity. Then there is a conclusion about the fragmentary type of professional cultures depending on the discursive complex of political, scientific and public reaction. It is worth noting the idea of an interparadigmal model of the research process based on the integration of institutional and discursive approach. 4 types of analysis were identified, and finally the structure of the work was created. The levels of an analysis were presented by the author, and I'm not going to ponder upon them. The description of the result of the research, based on the model provided, determined the content of the most informative part of the work, that is the 3rd chapter. The provision on conceptualization of discourse of professional culture allowed to expand the context of the research in the framework of critical discourse analysis. Well, other parts of the work are also important, and they comply with the requirements for the academic thesis. The author poses the problem of or the issue of the profession institution, and the issue is, are the problems that journalists face similar to the ones that other professionals face? How does the notion profession and activity correlate? The author talks about theoretical and historical prerequisites of studying the culture of journalism using comparative analysis and the results of cross-cultural and national research projects. The 2nd chapter is dedicated to the explanation of theoretical approach to the study of the professional culture, which author determined as discursive institutionalism. This part of the academic thesis demonstrated the use not only of scientific publications and works, but the information received during the expert interview with foreign researchers. The discussive issues that are worth noting are professional journalism culture and professional culture of a journalist, the targets and the addressees of discourse harmonization, conceptual uniformity of the profession in the event of its fragmentarity. Nevertheless, there are certain drawbacks. Excessive fundamentality could have been avoided through more clear definitions and methodological clearness, considering discursiveness and the structure of the term used. A number of spheres were being touched upon, which should be considered as potential areas of future research. The author and the respondents and the researchers cited talked about the key understanding of the professional culture of journalism in its contextual aspect. And there is a discussion on the dichotomy, polarization of fact and truth. This problem might be solved if we take philosophical analysis in the junction of social, personal, and virtual discursive areas. The author pays more attention to the formal and contextual aspects of the professional culture. But only when we look at the semantical and factological basis of the activity do we understand the true definition of this phenomenon. The author addresses the national peculiarities of professional culture within the context of education, and regional scientific schools of journalism have an impact on local and hyperlocal discourse. The model of research of professional culture at this stage of studying the phenomenon is considered to be optimal but not homogeneous. If the levels of professional, public, and social political discourse allow us to provide comparative analysis of its different variation, then the fourth level, that is fragmentation of the professional community of journalists, is an autonomous part of their research, which is a conceptual interpretation of the information received at earlier stages. There are certain stylistic remarks, one of which is related to the conclusions. When the author talks about the fragmentation of journalist culture, will be provided during the research. And there are certain logical discrepancies during the chapters. For example, as a result of the analysis, we came to the complex mapping of the discourse acts as the way to overcome the limitations, and so on. Despite the above-mentioned flaws, the academic thesis is the final work of a massive research cycle. The logic of the research, the structure of the academic thesis complies with the requirements, and Kamilla Nigmatullina shows that the research can be qualified as the one that can be awarded the degree of Doctor of Sciences. Thus, the academic thesis of Nigmatullina, specialization 100110, professional journalism, culture and modern Russia, complies to the requirements to the academic degrees, and Kamilla Nigmatullina deserves to be awarded the degree of Doctor of Political Sciences. Thank you for your attention. Kamilla Nigmatullina, the floor is yours. I suppose that answering your questions could have demanded a separate academic thesis. Well, the discursive topics are rather broad, so it's difficult to put an end to that. Fundamentally, achieving absolute structuredness of this work creates necessity, contextuality, and desired discursiveness. I can say that the contextual framework allows for the resolution of methodological and theoretical inconsistencies. Organization of the context through the components of media system, political system, and other systems plays a hybrid journalistic culture in a categorical framework. Further, I agree with Viktor Nikolaevich in the need to expand the problem field. And this is not only a deep immersion in the factual field, which entails ontological challenges associated with the categories of truth, which are especially relevant today. It's also a quasi-reality of the profession that can imitate institutional functions in discursively controlled virtual space. It's also about transforming objectivity and accountability in hybrid culture. Obviously, the philosophical potential of the study is far from being exhausted and would lead the author of the work to its continuation. It is also difficult not to pay enough attention to the problem of vocational education, especially based on personal motives of interest, because while writing the work, the author was the head of the educational program of the bachelor's degree in journalism, and in her own practice faced the creation of a new model for education. In the year of the 75th University for Journalism Education Speciality University, should be said that today it's very important to talk about the transformation of professional culture in the Russian context. The challenges were clearly manifested in the recent flash mob Forbidden Profession social networks, where journalists spoke about the origins of their values and education experience. In my thesis, I mentioned the gap in the line of professional education, and to this day, I myself face a disdainful attitude towards the journalism as a major in universities and among professional journalists. So this problem also requires additional reflection. However, every year, the conference of Moscow State University, my colleagues and I discuss in detail the purposes of today's journalism education and peculiarities of regional scientific pedagogical schools, involve the participants in the sections of discussions. I agree with the observation that the elements of the research model could become autonomous. Undoubtedly, the proposed model can be improved. I also agree with the comment about the conclusions that got into the wording of the problem. I would like to thank Igor Nikolaevich for a philosophical analysis of the presented conclusions and suggestions for expanding the research field. Thank you. Thank you, Kamilla Nigmatullina. Before giving the floor to Professor Bykov, dear members of the Dissertation Council, the full text of your reviews, of our reviews, can be seen on the website of St. Petersburg State University, and we have familiarized ourselves with them. So if there's going to be duplication, you might omit these passages. Professor Bykov, please, the floor is yours. Thank you for this opportunity to speak. Well, I suppose, colleagues, I will omit certain parts of my review. First of all, I'm not going to talk about the relevance because everything has already been mentioned by Igor Nikolaevich. I would only add that the transition from Soviet propagandistic model was not a linear process in professional journalism, and professional journalistic was not developing in a form of a line, but it had certain ups and downs which were well considered by the author. Well, the structure has already been mentioned. I'd like to talk about the general conclusions that I made after reading the academic thesis. First of all, I'd like to talk about the recommendations and the conclusions. The author used a significant amount of statistical data and specialist literature on the topic. That's the maximum volume of references used. The author also used the results of own field research and own scientific methods. Thus, the empirical data was used in a complex way. Statistical data, documents, thus we can see the high level of reliability of the scientific provisions. Also, the high level of validity is proved by the fact that the author published a number of works, both in Russia and abroad. Also, the results of the research were discussed at conferences. And several monographies containing the results of the research were published. The novelty lies in the fact that it provides complex research of the professional journalism culture in modern Russia based on a number of relevant scientific methods and methodologies. The conclusions are well based and the provisions are of high scientific importance. I'd like to move on to certain drawbacks. Firstly, when analyzing the texts of the in-depth interviews, special programs could be used, such as Atlas T, RQDA in vivo, and similar, which could have increased the objectivity of the results. I know that this approach is widely used throughout the world, and certain programs, computer assistant programs, are widely used to work with huge texts, and you can see that such programs allow to process large volumes of texts. Secondly, I agree with the author's evaluation of the limitations. Nevertheless, it's difficult to say whether these limitations were overcome in this research. The author says that the sampling, which was about 196, was 97, pages 202 to 106, and the low response of the respondents, that was 50%. The self-censure effect, these all could act as limitations. If respondents censor themselves, how can we talk about objective results of the research or of the survey? Thus, I'm not fully convinced that these limitations linked to the traditional methods were overcome. But nevertheless, we cannot get 100% statistical proved correlation. Thirdly, when mapping the fragments of professional culture of journalists in modern Russia, we believe it is impossible to use the mechanical transfer of socio-economic model of Zubarevich into the sphere of mass media. We consider it not quite appropriate, since it does not take into account the proportions of certain disproportionate of certain characteristic. Different Russias have different proportions. And I think that maybe it is not the case that in the first Russia, modernized characteristics are dominant. It might be possible that the employees, the journalists working at these state channels have a certain professional culture and ethical code which does not comply with the characteristics in the table. Next, there is an unresearched issue linked to the migration of professional journalists abroad and the recent changes in the Russian legislature on foreign agents, which has been in place starting from 2014 and is directly related to mass media. It is obvious that state politics in the field of information safety has a direct influence on creation and development of the professional journalism culture throughout the world. Each state creates minimal professional standards through the system of higher education, legal norms, and financing state mass media. I believe that not much attention was paid to the state policy was dedicated. Nevertheless, the above-mentioned drawbacks do not underestimate the academic thesis and are of pure recommendational nature. Thus, I believe the academic thesis by Kamilla Nigmatullina complies with the regulation of St. Petersburg State University for a thesis for academic degrees, and the applicant deserves to be awarded the degree of the doctor. I will start talking firstly about the use of computer-assisted program. I'd like to say that in the thesis, many arguments were given considering the fact not to use computer system programs. Machines, well, all types of machines, find it difficult to work with context, especially when we talk about irony. We've been having methodological discussions about this. As for low levels of sampling, I'd like to say that in the foreign publications there was only 1% of response rate, and that was quite a good result. Thus, we depend on personal contexts. Some researchers have a good database, others have cold context. As for the unstudied groups of journalists, I would like to thank you about that, since first of all we wanted to use the information about the journalists who left Russia within the 5 years. This idea emerged when we were using the sampling in 2016-2018. We found out that a number of journalists could not be found in the sampling since they left the profession, which I found interesting. But this is a separate issue, and it's difficult to put it into the canvas of the discourse. But of course, we plan to study these groups, as well as people who go into interconnected professions and those which receive the status of a foreign agent. And that's a very interesting problem. Thank you. And I'd like to give the floor to the Dean of the Faculty of Journalism, Professor Varganova. But prior to doing that, we, among the members of the Dissertation Council, we are looking at our applicants standing on high heels. We would offer you to sit down if you wish. So if you wish, you can take a seat. Dear colleagues, thank you very much. It is a great honor for me to be the member of such an important event at the development of the Institute of the High School of Mass Media and Communication, since the academic thesis is of huge interest, and I don't want to reiterate these structural provisions that my colleagues have well mentioned, but I would like to ponder upon certain aspects. The applicant has great courage, I suppose, when choosing the topics, which are one side are important from the determining the culture of journalism, and is defined as one of 4 Russias, and linked to the questions of the freedom of speech and journalistic classification can be found in other works. Nevertheless, this topic has another difficulty, which is related to its dynamics because of technological and sociological development. Thus, Kamilla Nigmatullina has quite a courage to research the topic which few decide to research. The journalist profession in 2010 were considered about 300,000 people, and now people related to journalism and to journalistic practice can be estimated at a far greater number. Kamilla Nigmatullina uses classical understanding of journalism culture and its link with professional mission, role, ethical values, autonomy, and so on. The academic thesis has a significant theoretical basis, and it leads to new empirical data. And based on the understanding of these empirical data, we get new knowledge about the journalism discourse, fragmentation of professional community, leading to the conclusions on the hybrid nature of the paradigm of Russian society and journalism culture. The author uses the concept, not the term, of hybrid culture, and the author mentions that the new scientific field, such as professional culture of Russian journalism, is not widely acknowledged in the professional community. And the thesis itself serves as a proof of the boundaries of this culture. Those who presented their thesis during the Soviet times should think about the importance of the issue for the market, for this issue is linked to the labor market, to business, and to important professional structures such as journalism education. And the work fully complies with the requirements to identify and to solve social problems. You can get detailed information on the academic thesis in my review that is published on the university website. I would like to say that the methods used by the author are well-grounded, and combining qualitative and quantitative methods yields good results in this academic thesis. As for goals of the thesis, they are achieved in the thesis, and along with theoretical achievements, the necessity of mapping journalism discourse shows the key concepts and shows journalism concepts and show the dynamics of the formation of journalistic culture. And recommendation of harmonizing professional discourse because of the identified controversies is very positive. I have a couple of comments. One is conceptual. Declaring hybridity and discursiveness and dynamic nature of journalism culture as actual characteristics. The author postulates the new normality of the theory of journalism. At the same time, the text of the academic thesis itself questions the normative nature of the culture fragmentation, talking about the link between fragmentarity and disbalance. I would like the author to give a clearer conceptual and normative assessment of the hybrid character of journalistic culture. Secondly, Appendix 6 with the journalistic interviews. I would like to link my question to it. Appendix 6 gives interviews with foreign journalists, and Appendix 8 gives own interviews without the representatives of the domestic school. Nevertheless, this cannot serve as a significant drawback of the work, and the work complies with all the requirements posed to the academic thesis and the academic thesis of Nigmatullina Kamilla Nigmatullina, professional journalism culture in modern Russia, complies to all the requirements according to the order 6821/1, and the applicant Kamilla Nigmatullina deserves to be awarded the degree of Doctor of Political Sciences. Thank you, Elena Leonidovna. There were only 2 questions, but I wonder how you could answer the first question briefly. First of all, I'd like to thank Elena Leonidovna for the question. It's a great honor for me that you are a member of the Dissertation Council. Well, I try to be really brief. It is very interesting that the remark that Elena Leonidovna made about work postulating normativity or normality for journalistic culture was essentially hybrid. In the first chapter, I emphasized that in formulating the author's methodology, I was not faced with the task of opposing the principle of normative theory. The ambitiousness of the task was that I tried to bring Russian and domestic approaches to the consideration of journalist culture, and without rejecting the normality, place journalistic culture in the general frame of discussive institutionalism. Normality in discussiveness is quite possible because at each specific moment in time, at a certain context, such characteristics of a hybrid journalistic culture are indeed formed that become the norm of the context and time. In this sense, the theoretical conceptuality of the work can really be called a new normativity. But this may be quite a large discussion. As for the disparity in the samplings, foreign researchers took part in expert interviews, and Russian journalists took part in the survey. And these are samples related to different objectives. In the survey, served as a starting point for checking the result of cross-cultural studies and their methodology related to define the characteristics of journalistic culture. Then expert interviews were intended to further verify the methodology. Considering that all foreign respondents were in charge of cross-cultural studies, it was logical for me to turn to them with questions about the limitations of the methods and its possible development. And Russian colleagues presented their ideas in their monographies and publications, and I had to conduct private interviews with foreign colleagues. Now we give the floor to Gregory Simons. Gregory, the floor is yours.
Okay, so already many things have been said in terms of the focus, quality, etc. The one thing that I would add that it is very thorough and exact in terms of explaining why a particular approach is being used, justifying that. So, which is not always given in some theses. So in this regard, it was definitely a plus. Definitely an interesting topic and one which is evolving. As you say, this is something which is going to continue to change, but to what exactly? So it's a moving target. Now, of course, you're talking about some of those awkward aspects for Russian journalists, but especially when you talk about things like self-censorship and these kinds of things. But in my experience, and in one time in particular, when interviewing the head of Reuters in Moscow in the early 2000s, one of the things which stuck out was Reuters was avoiding writing about Chechnya at the time, a hot topic, because they did not want to get the same pressure that domestic media outlets were getting. So this is not only about Russian journalism, but foreign journalism in Russia experiencing some of the same things. So this is quite an interesting look from this perspective as well. So yes, definitely commendable. I would just add that the so-called faults are quite minor, which I found, especially in the form of typos. So integrant instead of integral, disbalance instead of imbalance, editorial stuff instead of editorial staff, these kinds of things. But also, one could say, I'm not sure if it was something with the translation, perhaps it was different in the Russian language text, but for example, on page 16, stating that Boris Lazovsky and Vladimir Oleshko were from Moscow State University. Well, no, from Ural Federal. So, and one minor additional point, the paper of Jukka Pietalainen, this is not a paper, this was in fact his doctoral thesis, which you mentioned. So very minor inaccuracies, but nonetheless. I would ask, on page 181, you mentioned something about Western-minded product. I'm not quite sure what you mean by this, so after I finished, if you could just please explain exactly what you mean by Western-minded product. And one thing which was good to see is a very good balance between international literature and Russian literature, and you brought them together quite nicely. Sometimes you get a bit of a disjoint when someone introduced international and domestic, but you did a very good job in balancing those and sort of explaining in a contextual manner very convincingly, critically as well, which was good. So I would just add that by far the strengths of the thesis outweigh any problematic issues. This is very clear. And well, definitely encourage you to continue, hopefully this. There's much more work to be done in the future on this topic, something changing, and to finally close on the dissertation meets the basic requirements established by Order 6821-1, and you deserve the academic award, Candidate of Political Science and Speciality 10.0110, and clause 11 of the aforementioned order by the author of the thesis is not broken. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Simons. Kamilla, that's...
Да, благодарю, профессор.
I'd like to thank Professor Simons for your remarks and for reading the translation of the work. Well, of course, it couldn't reflect all the contextual nuances of the original text. But I would like to thank the Professor Simons that despite some flaws of the word use, for highly praising the content. Well, in response to this remark, I'm planning to prepare an abridged version to the work in English, in which greater attention will be paid to improving the quality of the academic style. And when we talked about Western-minded product, we mean the product created by journalists, created in the paradigm of the Western standards of journalism. It seems to me that separate opponents' remarks are connected with the difference in academic cultures. For example, the review mentions the presence of bullet points in the conclusion or the absence of references to key works of Thesis in the third chapter in the work. Again, I can only answer that these shortcomings will be eliminated in the work for a wide English-speaking audience. As for an important substantive remark about the need for more detailed consideration of the transit period of journalism in the beginning of the 2000s, here the author encountered a natural obstacle in the form of age and experience. The fact that this period was a time when I studied at the Faculty of Journalism, became a beginner specialist. Many contextual aspects at the time remained unclear to me who hadn't worked in journalism in the 90s. In addition to personal circumstances, there were also methodological ones. So in the sample of respondents of this study, a large share is occupied by people who came into the profession in the last 10 years. That is just like me. They haven't experienced the difficulties of transit in their own practice. And the profession of journalism in Russia is rapidly growing younger. And what is pleasant, it's replenished mainly by graduates of specialized faculties. For them, the transit period is part of history, and category of internal slavery is not perceived as a cultural context of the development of profession. This period, as well as early ones, was investigated by many domestic scientists. Therefore, it is present in the work in the form of references to the works of colleagues. Nevertheless, the topic of generational gap in the professional culture of Russian journalism is one of the leitmotifs of the work. With all the desire to oppose the idea of the results of Svetlana Pasty with new arguments and observation, I was faced with the opposite. There's really difference between generations, although the journalists themselves do not understand it as such and do not think that this is significant. The only thing that hasn't been yet proved is to conform between the generation of journalists who came to the profession after the departure of Yeltsin and after the events of Bolotnaya in 2011. This requires a separate dimension in the context and an increase in the sample, as Professor Bykov justly remarked. And the floor is given to Professor Ilchenko, Sergei Nikolaevich. How much time do I have? Good afternoon, dear colleagues. The name modern journalism culture in modern Russia is questioned because our specialty will be called media communication journalism, which make it quite relevant. I believe that now we can see an academic research and a complex analysis of the issue of profession of journalism, the volume of the thesis and the quality of the empirical material involved deserve being praised. The structure of the work is clear. The theoretical information is provided in a logical way, and the actual picture of journalism is provided. Much has already been said about the structure of the work. In my opinion, the volume of the text, which is 375 pages, is excessive. As for the theoretical base are more than 200 reference books, which characterizes the book, the academic thesis. The appendices show the logic of the researcher. We have already heard the question about the interviews with foreign journalists and the researchers. And the applicant has already provided information about those questions, why these were the experts in the foreign opinion. We do not question the results of the research obtained with the theoreticians dedicated to the professional culture of Russian journalists. It is clear that the in-depth analysis of the scientific works, of which the applicant is the co-author, is a very strong aspect of the academic thesis. The target of the research is well defined. Paying attention to what research was conducted by our foreign partners. It is well worth noticing that this aspect gives a politological sense to the thesis, because we know that foreign researchers might be biased when they talk about the problems that domestic journalists face in their work. Kamilla Nigmatullina wants to be unbiased in her work, which is difficult to achieve since we can see the domineering ideas of foreign counterparts, and it influences the concept. It would be better to see the personal author's approach, how foreign experts relate to their estimates of the realia of Russian media. Some of the foreign experts became the interlocutors giving interviews to Kamilla Nigmatullina. The criteria of professionalism of the journalist was a very important part. On page 55, the author talks about 20 actions of journalists, according to which one can estimate the signs of professionalism. Then you mention 4 signs of profession, but these signs do not seem well-grounded. In my opinion, the domineering criteria is 1. If the author gets financial remuneration for the published material. And Kamilla Nigmatullina knows that, for she was a practical journalist prior to her research. It is clear that we see the influence of Western discourse on the freedom of speech. Nevertheless, we shouldn't rely on the ideas of Nungren, who wants to combine the results of his research for such countries as Russia, Poland, and Sweden. It's not worth mentioning the works of theoreticians who never worked in Russia and who present their ideas only from the theoretical points of view, not from the practical ones. The same can be said about the mentioning of the experience of studying BRICS countries, and as well as a Hansisch questionnaire. The scientific discrepancy here is clear, since domestic researchers mentioned by Kamilla Nigmatullina use one single criteria of categorizing different categories of journalists. But we think that the issue is much deeper one. This is what should make it more political. If we talk about ideological and political discrepancies in the views of certain journalists and their so-called owners. On page 193 of the thesis, you talk about PK, but you don't say that this organization was officially considered to be a foreign agent. The third chapter of the thesis is considered to be of crucial importance, which is dedicated to the issue fragmentation. This part of the thesis is the largest one, more than 120 pages, and this is a part of significant conceptual importance. The author uses all intellect powers and theoretical powers based on the analysis of the functioning of the concepts. The ideas of locality are used in the text, and the relationship between the state and mass media are analyzed, and the role that journalists take in their professional practice are discussed. Thus, self-censorship notion is one of the key ones. It can be noted that the majority of the representatives of the profession, this notion is the key attribute of their work. The author agrees that evaluation of such practice should proceed from specific, objective, and subjective aspects of media functioning. And these should include the characteristics of the professional culture of each journalist and political, ideological, and economic aspects. And in here, many examples taken from the history of domestic journalists could be cited. Some of the fragments of the interviews of Russian practical workers could have supported your theoretical ideas, but it's up to the author to decide or not decide the participants. Diana Kochalova might serve as a negative example, where she mixes the head of Japan and mixes the name of the head of Chechnya, Budayev, which is linked to the operation itself. From comments and recommendations, one more is that the development of the media system of the Russian Federation is schematic in the perception of the author. For example, page 33, the author says that a presidential pool was formed during the first 20 years of 21st century, while we know that it was formed in 1990s under Yeltsin. The author should pay more attention to the context of development of Russian journalism from the point of view of the current legislative system and economic issues. Thus, he wouldn't have been too reliant on the ideas of Western researchers. Nevertheless, all the above-mentioned comments and ideas concerning the thesis do not serve as considerable obstacles and are of purely recommendational nature. The propositions on harmonizing the profession could be considered a very important aspect of the work, and since she is the head of the journalism baccalaureate where she currently works, and one of the heads of the institutes of the Higher School of Economics and Maths. Well, this is not the head, I'm sorry. Our life is very dynamic, it seems. Nevertheless, the author remained as the head of one of the departments of the institutions. And we hope that the theory will be assimilated thus and used in the educational process. The author participated in 35 conferences. The author published 20 works, 2 monographies. The targets set by the author of the academic thesis were achieved. The results obtained are valid. The applicant deserves to be awarded the degree of Doctor of Political Sciences, and the academic thesis complies to all the requirements of the Audit and Bidable State University. Specialty 1001, 10 Journalism. Thank you, Sergei Nikolaevich. You almost fit into the time limit. If we talk about Diana Kachalova, I would like to say that the head of Japan is emperor in a way. I'd like to thank Sergei Nikolaevich for his review, and I'd like to say that Sergei Nikolaevich knows what it means to work for the newspaper Moscow Time. I'll combine my answer to a number of comments, which are generally related to the presence of a large volume of English language literature, foreign concepts, and experts in the works. The first argument is related to the fact that many works and names were introduced in scientific circulation in Russian for the first time. The idea of constructing convergence of foreign domestic research approaches required a detailed acquaintance of the Russian-speaking audience with the modern heritage of foreign researchers. While Russian language words are already in circulation, they are abundantly quoted and used. It was necessary for me to clarify certain aspects that might seem to us not well understood. According to my humble opinion, I would like to have such projects in our country as well. Secondly, in this conversation, foreign scientists learn new details about Russian journalistic culture, which, as I would like it, will eventually help to overcome politicized and cliched ideas about Russia and journalism abroad. It's no secret that individual researchers generally do not recognize the existence of journalism in Russia, but call it propaganda. Thus, the volume of English language resources corresponds to their absence in the academic discourse about journalistic culture. All possible limitations in methodology of foreign studies are also discussed in detail in the second chapter from a critical perspective. It's difficult to talk about the excessive influence of English language literature on the interpretation paradigm of the author, who consistently argues with the results of cross-cultural studies in which Russia became a research case. If we talk about the criteria of professionalism and understanding of Russian and foreign interests, including sociologists of the profession, they are analyzed and detailed in order to avoid understanding that there is a monetary reward is the only possible option. Especially valuable in this case is the work of Silla Westboard, where, in our opinion, a comprehensive understanding of the standard of professionalism in the media is given. The text contains quotations from the appendices. However, the author considered the task not to quote, but to generalize and formulate conclusions based on the analysis of the collected imperial data. I agree that applications are of separate interest to the reader, but this is a standalone product within the framework of the thesis. As for the legislative context of development of professional culture, it is not considered separately. It's mentioned in the explanation of the relevance and precedes the research in the third chapter. Nevertheless, respondents speak about this context in detail in their interviews, which is presented in the appendix. Of course, changes in the legislation in the media or information can limit the expand activities of the subjects of the media field and also directly affect the autonomy of the media. On the other hand, the legislative context doesn't work in isolation from the technological one. This is clearly seen in interviews, and journalists equally painfully perceive the pressure of the authorities, the founder of the platforms. And perhaps for many media, the pressure of platforms and their algorithms today we declare technical break because Greg Simons is not in the conference.
Он здесь.
I am. I just needed to do.
Спасибо. Thank you, Greg. We are again together. Пожалуйста, Камилла Ринатовна, продолжаем. Перерыв.
The break is considered closed. We continue. Today, the pressure of platforms and their algorithms today has more influence than before. And platform dictatorship could be a separate level of research. And I'd like to quote the text from the thesis. There is the clear understanding that the legislative orders have become harsher, especially if we talk about the extremism. The consequences of publishing in both media and social media have become harsher. The editors have become accustomed to a policy of caution that aims to preserve the editorial process and the team. According to the respondents, not a single law passed after 2012 has benefited the media and the audience. And we give the floor to Professor Oleshko. Dear colleagues, I'd like to say that Yelena Leonidovna mentioned a very important aspect, that it's necessary to meet and discuss these issues when there are many much research conducted on the topic of the importance of journalism and the journalistic culture. Today we exist in such a difficult period. Today, for example, in the magazine Generalist, there was stated that today we are in the era of post-journalism. In this respect, we might agree or disagree, whether we talk about the new school, about the old school, but the fact that in the modern Institute of Journalism we can see the generation gap and social and generation gaps and differences due to the modern era and previous era are important. I try to be brief. Would like to talk about the validity of the research and the validity of the conclusions of the academic thesis, which is provided by the in-depth analysis of the foreign and domestic works and the analysis of empirical information. Methodological basis is also reliable, since it follows the principle of discursive institutionalism, which is considered within the context of the discourse analysis. This all allows us to say that the structure of the work allows us to see clear aspects of journalism culture. I will agree that the fragmentation of the professional community can be found in the key concepts of understanding of professionalism and social roles, page 333, and the understanding of values and standards, page 330, and the data distribution on mental maps and the illustrations provided and the graphics provided in the thesis allowed to provide an easier understanding of a complex material. The third chapter can be considered the most important one, and the researcher presents conclusions of the that can be used to harmonize the discourse. I would like to ponder upon the contradictions, because each development is based on counteracting contradictions. In order to harmonize we need to use a thesis of defining the modern journalistic culture through thinking about the future of the profession. And this idea of thinking about what expects us, what is awaiting us, very often is limited to instrumental characteristics. But the mental aspects and the digitalization of these mental dogmas and the new ideas is usually not touched upon. As for novelty, it is doubtless that the academic thesis can be characterized by novelty. It provides logical reasoning. My colleagues also mentioned the number of publications, articles, and conferences attended by the author. As for practical importance, it is linked with the use of the results when strategically planning the media industry as a whole, a new media, and in the field of solving contradictions. Thus, educational discourse about journalism and the factors of development are of special importance. On the whole, I would like to say that the academic thesis is a work of high quality. Nevertheless, there are certain comments. Since the major is 100110, journalism, we believe that it was necessary to identify the link between the Russian journalism culture with the Russian political processes which are taking place currently, such as social transformation because of the digital and generational gaps and the role of new media. Our colleagues from Moscow State University already mentioned that, and I do agree that the applicant should have addressed her attention to this aspect as well. The second remark. The applicant considered different media systems and conducted comparative analysis of journalist culture from the point of view of foreign authors, predominantly. Nevertheless, the lack of the representatives of other educational schools, such as Ural schools of journalism, because starting from 2005, 7 monographies were published in our university, and they are interinstitutional, and researchers from Moscow State University and other universities took part in that, and this was under the aegis of professional culture of journalists. And I suppose that in here the applicant should identify the contradictions that describe the original journalism, including safety, intercultural information safety, intercultural communication, polyethnical media, contradictions because of the certification of mass media, and the level of economic development of the regions. It would have clarified the recommendations of the applicant. It seems to us controversial to the novelty point 4, the idea of the applicant that the lack of homogeneity of the journalism community in Russia hasn't been studied, because on the whole, the conceptual conclusions and practical recommendations of the leading researchers, especially of Moscow State University, were discussed systematically and comprehensively in the text of the thesis. One of the provisions is excessive, especially the one about the thing that professional community is not monolith, since it doesn't need to be proved, but it rather points to the viewpoint of the author. Also, there are certain typos that can be found in the work. On the whole, finalizing, I would like to say that the academic thesis by Kamilla Nigmatullina, Professional Journalism Culture in Modern Russia, is a scientific work possessing certain unity and comprehensiveness. This is a relevant, valid research which solved an important issue for the Russian media community, that of analyzing Russian journalism culture and creating the tools to harmonize the professional discourse. Thus, the academic work by Kamilla Nigmatullina complies to the requirements of the order from the 1st of September 2016, and the applicant Nigmatullina Kamilla Renatovna deserves to be awarded the scientific degree of Doctor of Political Sciences in specialty 10.1.10. Thank you for your attention. Vladimir Fedorovich, thank you very much. Vladimir Fedorovich, thank you very much for talking about the interviews that was published 2 days ago in the magazine Journalist. That's Miroshnichenko interview. That's abstract of his recent book. Miroshnichenko is now working at Toronto University. Should he be considered an foreign expert? He was in the group 3, and he talks about the fact that there is no institution of the profession. This is a very interesting text, and we have analyzed it with our students. As for the connection of the thesis with political sciences, it is expressed in the following. The study of journalistic culture in the modern interpretation grew out of the study of media systems, in which the general political framework of functioning of the media is key. In our work, we focus on such a political aspect of formation of the modern professional culture of journalists as conflict of the global nature of modern media with the civilizational platforms of individual media system, as the claims of journalism to political intentionality, as mentioned by Igor Nikolaevich, and social representation as the transfer of the focus of political conflict from the social sphere to the media sphere. Perhaps the socio-political processes of the past 20 years haven't been described in sufficient detail, but the empirical part, namely interviews with journalists and media manager, represent the very important socio-political context in which today's professional culture is formed. Finally, critical discourse analysis is directly related to the study of the categories of power and authority, political domineering, and the exercise of power through discourse. The correspondence of the context of the work to the formula of the major is confirmed by the fact that the following areas of research are presented: journalistic activity in the system of information and political relations in society, new journalism of the 21st century, new methods of research, analysis and forecasting of mass information processes, technologies, methods, practical measures and prospects for the formation of the information space in Russia, features of structuring the information sphere. Answering the comment about the absence of representatives of the Royal School of Professional Culture Research in the list of references, I can only regret that the framework of the research did not allow making a full analysis of regional research schools. Nevertheless, I do know about all the publications of the university after the conferences, professional culture of journalists during the era of social and technological transformation media sphere. When I write that the phenomenon of journalistic culture hasn't received due attention in national studies, well, I don't mean the total volume of individual works in recent years, but since the volume is significant and the interest is high, but the lack of comprehensive research that would theoretically cover a variety of approaches to the consideration of the object, and empirically its multidimensionality, hybridity, fragmentation, and discursiveness. My personal conviction is that the time has come to repeat the large-scale research which was carried out with the participation of Luisa Grigorevna Switich and her colleagues in the 90s. American partners of the Russian team, researchers Weaver and Wilnert, are currently conducting Pan-American research panels studying journalists. However, in Russia, no one undertakes such a large-scale task, with the exception of Zircon, whose results are cited in the work. As for the redundancy of the ninth provision for defense, the lack of solidarity of the professional communities mentioned here is connection with the fragmentation of culture and discourse. It is in this connection that the disunity of journalists hasn't yet been investigated. In general, of course, ideological divisions in the professional community are a given from which we proceed. And unfortunately, due to inattention, and Yevgeny Vladimirovich is often mentioned as co-author with Vladimir Fedorovich. Sorry. Thank you, Kamilla Nigmatullina. Now, I, as the chairperson, have to give my review, and I can agree with my colleagues. I'm holding my review, which is 14 pages long, and I'm not going to voice it word by word. I'd like to begin saying that the novelty and the relevance of the topic are clear. The second part of the second chapter, where Kamilla Nigmatullina talks about the author's methodology, and the prerequisite of this methodology was the supposition that the journalism can be reflected in discourse, not even in discourse, but even in metaphor, in the number of discursive mirrors, so to say. We agree with this opinion of the author, saying that the fragmented journalistic culture can be characterized by discursive institutionalism, and with the help of the complex discourse analysis at different levels, with pointing out specific institutionalistic logics and categories. The academic thesis is a well-grounded work, which is based on a significant number of references, uses a large number of empirical data. The work is logical, and the structure complies to the requirements. The language of the thesis is laconic, clear, and doesn't have this pseudo-scientific complexity. It is a pleasure to read this work, which is not often the case. Now, as to the comments and questions. The first, the choice of a theoretical approach. The author on page 167 writes that many approaches, which became the basis of the previous research, leads to this idea. And then the author describes the social field by Boutier, actor network theory, comparative theory, the theory of four theories of press, de-Westernization theory, and so on. However, the text does not explicitly give neither the criteria nor the levels or any other types of classifications. These theories are not similar in their status. They begin to different fields. Thus, the review becomes eclectic and non-operational in a way. Secondly, certain hypotheses might be considered discursive. Page 185 states that the author, when communicating with the educational specialists, Indian specialists, and media experts in 2010, led to certain issues, and then formulates the issues and the hypothesis, which we do not agree with. Hypothesis 3, the formation of journalistic professional groups within the communities is at the boundary of external and internal factors influencing the profession and media system as a whole. This is not a hypothesis, this is a fact. The discussion of this and the further hypothesis leads to more general issues. That's the idea, the questions of dynamics and the internal fragmentation of the profession, of the highest level of the social importance and social and ethical aspects when we talk about the post-totalitarian transitional system and digital transformation. The author thus used a certain level of meta transformations. Third issue, a rather discursive one. Page 217 says, as a starting point for reconstructing the census, we chose institutional logics, normative, market, logic of the community, and then the table 4 is provided. Two questions arise. How does the author thinks about inter-influence of institutional media logic and their interpenetration, such as normative and market, for example, which is very often the case. Fourthly, one important issue related to the methodology requires clarification. That's the issue of dependency or independency of discourses. The author's methodology allows to research 4 levels of discourse, which reflect conceptual and performative aspects of the culture. This issue is especially important when the bearer of different institutional identities is the subject causing the discourse. Thus, a methodological question arises. How to create the lines of determination of institutional logics of this or that role model. We might deal with the external to the subject discursive practice and an interviewer or a researcher. Thus, the author thinks and creates the external factors of the discourse by contextual framing of institutional positioning. The fifth question is related to the category of the signs of discursiveness of the institution of journalists. On page 272, the author says that these signs can be found in the professional discourse of the current time. But how can this category be meta-theoretically defined? How can the signs of discursiveness be found in the categories found in the discourse? Why are these categories and not concepts or attitudes? We believe that the signs of discursiveness empirically can be found not in particular categories, but in dichotomic discrepancy of the discourse and bipolar oppositions. And the final point. This is rather a doubt, not a comment. The final chapters of the author of the work talk about the ways to harmonize journalistic discourse. harmony is better than disharmony. Well, in the art, maybe yes, but what about the society? What harmony are we talking about? The harmony between wolves and sheep, between management and employees? Sometimes it might be perceived as the movement into the right direction. We are not sure that harmonization of the discourse is a must. It is a very difficult issue. Disharmonious a priori meta-discourse of the society competes for social resources. Is it possible to provide harmonization of the local discourse? Power is never evenly distributed, and this is a problem for certain professions which entail a high ethical component and social responsibility. I would like to reiterate that the above-mentioned comments are the ground for debate. The overall perception of the work is extremely high. The thesis contains scientific novelty and complies to the requirements of the doctoral thesis. The academic thesis by Nigmatullina Kamilla Nigmatullina, Professional Journalism, Culture in Modern Russia, complies to the major requirements established by the order of the 1st of September 2016, and applicant Nigmatullina Kamilla Nigmatullina deserves to be awarded the scientific degree of Doctor of Political Sciences and specialty 1001-10 Journalism. Point 11 hasn't been violated. I would like to apologize for such lengthy remarks. But this is because I'm related to a sociological and politological research. Although your review was 14 pages long, my answers are only 2 pages long. The only criteria for selecting theoretical approaches in the review of the second chapter is the mentioning theories and concepts inside of source of the problem. It was important to understand what the researchers of journalistic culture relied on, and to choose a concept that would be most suitable for solving the problems of station research. I agree with the review. Came rather compact, and it was necessary to balance the parts of the second chapter so that sufficient attention was paid to the substantiation of the method. As for the discussion of the hypothesis, well, discussion is their necessary component. It's great that there are certain issues. As for the third hypothesis, which states the trivial facts about the junction of external and internal factors that shape cultures, at the stage of its formulation, it was heuristically impossible to establish which factors can be mentioned. At the same time, we agree that at another level of analysis, the transformation of socially significant professions, the importance of digital transparency of such specialization could be noted. This means that the immediate presence of such professions as journalist, teacher, doctor, increases the requirements for professional responsibility of specialists, creates additional tensions in the classic confrontation between craft and mission, the service sector and the sphere of public duty. On the example of journalism, we really see the increased expectation in society from the public mission of representatives of our profession. The remark about institutional logics is correct, and we write in the work that their formulation research is pilot. The interpretation of logics is obvious as an interpenetration of professional roles of journalists. In practice, there are neither pure characteristics of journalistic subgroups, nor their institutional logics, nor professional roles. Claudia, the collective, also write about this when they recognize the abstractedness and universality of theoretizing. On the other hand, this abstractness allows generalizations and trends to be made, as opposed to simply stating the facts that an object is a complex mix that can be divided into parts. Guild logic can be institutional. If in similar addition we fix the implementation of functions aimed at transferring knowledge in specific form, at solving social philosophical problems of society, at socializing certain groups of society. Answering the question about the influence of the research in the formulation of institutional logics as a subject outside the described processes, I'd like to note that the author of the work refers to himself as an entrepreneurship paradigm of cognition, in which many realities are socially constructed, reality is interpreted from the standpoint of scientists, and method or conditions subjective and contextual. When using the phrase categories of discourse in relation to the science of discursiveness of the institution of journalism, we meant concepts. In contrast to categories of discourse, which are its content characteristics, such as conceptual integrity, synergy, contextuality, etc. And finally, the question of harmonizing discourse is perhaps the most important for us. And as for the controversial nature of the work and its possible continuation, first, it should be noted that due to the lack of generally used understanding of this category regarding media discourse, in our work, harmonization is understood as the nature of the communication process during which contradictions are articulated and become clearer to all subjects. In this case, the removal of contradictions is not a necessary condition, but the clear definition by the parties contributes to a clear attribution of dialogical grounds for all participants in the communication. For example, for the professional journalist community, this may look like productive discussion of professional practices where all participants understand each other's values and their origins, and the result of the discussion is clear agreements or compromises. It's impossible to deny that discourse is power, and there will be a dominant force in any discussion, but critical discourse analysis allows us to reveal these forces, make the fact of dominance public, and clarify media interpretations. Thank you. We are willing to continue the discussion, but we need to follow the rules of the procedure. Dear members of the Dissertation Council, we have received several external reviews. There are 3 of them from the Dean of the Faculty of Journalism. From the Dean of the Faculty. That's the review at the level of the Dean from Tomsk University, Mysnikov Ilya Yurnichev, from the Doctor of Political Sciences, Rostov, Rostov State Technical University, Akopov Grigor Leonidovich, and from Doctor of Philology, Associate Professor of the Department of Philology, Moscow State University, Verkovsky Andrei Vladimirovich. Since all the reviews were published on St. Petersburg's University website, I offer to read only the main points. So I'll be very brief in familiarizing you with the reviews. So we begin with Mysnikov Ilya Yurjevich. The review is positive. There are no remarks. The author says that according to methodological criteria, the author corresponds to the major. The methodology is well-grounded, and the academic thesis fully complies with the requirements of St. Petersburg State University, and the author should be awarded with the academic degree of Doctor of Political Sciences. Akopov, Doctor of Political Sciences, provided a positive review. It is noted that the academic thesis corresponds to the major 100110 journalism. It has all the criteria of novelty, relevance, and it can be said that the academic thesis by Nigmatullina Kamilla Nigmatullina corresponds to the requirements to the academic works, and the applicant deserves to be awarded the academic degree of Doctor of Political Sciences. And point 11 hasn't been violated. And finally, the review by Anthea Vladimirkovsky, whom we know really well, from Lomonosov State University. The review is positive. The author states that the thesis is one of the best theoretically grounded thesis that he has ever read, and the models used are not only just listed but are used in the context of the author's research. And we cannot doubt the validity of the research. But Vladimirkovsky states a number of comments or remarks. There are two issues and two remarks to be mentioned. They are of discursive nature and are provided within the framework of scientific discussion. First, I believe that the elements of professional culture are so complex that it's difficult to quantify them, especially at such a geographical scale as used in this work. The territorial disintegrity makes it difficult to use qualitative methods as well. How did you get the information about a specific region, finding dozens of respondents from these regions? The meta-systems of the regions are differ widely, and the determinants of these differences are not always clear, and much was written by Kyria about that. Is it possible to find a more productive way to solve the issues that the author wants to solve? Secondly, it would be pleasant to see ethnographic research conclusions, which are rare for domestic scientific discourse. The author rightly mentions that there is a turn to ethnography in world science. Yes, ethnography is rather complex, but the level of the thesis shows that the applicant is capable of conducting such comprehensive work at a very good level. The academic thesis complies with all the requirements, and the applicant deserves to be awarded the degree of the Doctor of Political Sciences. Kamilla Nigmatullina, the floor is yours. I'd like to thank all the authors of the external reviews, and I'd like to provide a brief answer to the last remarks. I would like to thank all the authors and answer to Andrei Vladimirovich. He rightly notes that the use of quantitative methods is not enough to identify the features of professional culture, especially in the regional level. The reviewer proposes to use in-depth interviews, which is partially embodied in the work and the study of 33 Russian regions. Hence the second question, a remark about the lack of an ethnographic method in search. We support this idea. In particular, the work mentions the regular use of ethnography joint studies. Today, the applicant had the opportunity to immerse himself in the life of regional editorial offices as an editor of the Journalist magazine, member of the organizing committee of the Golden Fund of the Press 2.0 competition, as a result of which she was able to study in detail the nature of the work of editorial offices in different regions. Ethnographic research is temporarily limited due to the pandemic and the remote nature of editorial staff, which is also a wonderful subject to consider. Thank you. Thank you, Kamilla Nigmatullina, very much. Dear colleagues, the members of the Dissertation Council, I would like to address those who are in the auditorium and those who are in the remote access mode. Is everybody satisfied with the answers provided by Nigmatullina Renata? We need to follow the rules of procedure. Now it's time to express the ideas of those present in the room. Professor Gromova, Ludmila, the floor is yours. Dear colleagues, I see today's event as a present to the anniversary of 75 years of journalism education as a bit of a state university. I think that the work is relevant and highly interesting. And the level of the work is really high. The comments mentioned before were appropriate. And this work, the thesis itself, the research, opens new perspectives for future research. Talking about the anniversary of journalism education, I'd like to point out that Kamilla Nigmatullina, in her research, successfully combines traditional approaches, methodologies, methods, and the search for new methodologies, which is a rather topical issue nowadays. Without continuing the discussion, I would like to wish Kamilla Nigmatullina, as the head of the Department of Digital Media Communication, to continue the research on the topic within the framework of the work of the department, and to study a very interesting sphere that we encounter, that is digital culture, the culture of digital media. And I would like to wish you success. I'd like to thank all the colleagues for this marvelous scientific discussion that we witnessed today. We received great pleasure from this professional conversation that we witnessed. Thank you, Lyudmila Petrovna. Is there anybody else present in the hall? Nikonov Sergei Borisovich, the Doctor of Political Sciences, please, the floor is yours. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. It was previously mentioned that there were certain comments related to the thesis, but I would like to answer to the idea about the comments which were not quite just, especially the comment of the issue about the foreign agent. And colleagues agree that foreign agents should not be mentioned by mass media because it contradicts legislation. Does anybody else present in the hall want to speak? We will have the opportunity to answer a little bit later according to procedure. According to the procedure, we need to voice the question that we received during the defense. We didn't receive any. Wait so can you collate a little bit, you'll have time. Then we give the floor to the scientific supervisor, Doctor of Political Sciences, Professor of St. Petersburg State University. Svetlana Sergeyevna, the floor is yours. Tell us about the applicant, first of all, the personality of the applicant. Good afternoon, dear colleagues, dear council, all those present. It is a great pleasure for me to take the floor here today because she's my first doctoral candidate. As you could see, this is a very independent work, research paper, and this was a life target of Kamilla Nigmatullina to create this work. We discussed this research at an early stage and when we discussed the articles and monographies. And when we received the information on the censorship, when Renata showed me this information, in tears I phoned our co-author in Berlin about the information that we got, because what we got was that the burden of individual responsibility lies on the shoulders of journalists in our country, how little protected they are. The journalists in our country every day, on daily basis, need to choose the rules of conduct. They have very few guidelines that might rely on in comparison with Western cultures. And the pathos of harmonizing, and I would like to add to the ideas expressed by Dmitry Petrovich, and talk about the antagonistic and agonistic discourse, about which much is being said in journalism. And this is related to the personality of Kamilla Nigmatullina. For the applicant conducted a scientific research, and the value of this research and why the society needs this research is extremely important. And we work together with Kamilla Nigmatullina, and thus I'm familiar with her of different stages. Kamilla Nigmatullina is the person who bonds media industry with academic sciences to such an extent that this is almost an ideal. About 10 years she spent as a practical journalist and then came into academic work. And when she started her academic work, her links with journalists developed, and they act as the support and assistance to the community. She works in the editorial staff of the magazine Journalist and presents lectures, provides consultations, small regional editorial offices. So why do we get information from regions? Because the applicant participated in the works of editorial committees. She found the leading media professionals who now participate in the work of our baccalaureate program. She is a unique expert, and I'm not sure if there are up to a dozen of experts of her level in Russia. Her academic life is prolific. She's the youngest head of the department in Russia. She initiated the transformation of our department into the department of the digital mass media. And since then, we made a great leap toward digitalization. Her courses in the master's program are held with the participation of the leading experts of media industry. She works as an administrator, and the volume of work is enormous. I witnessed how throughout 5-6 years she became a great scientist, became a person who knows how to work as a journalist, as a person having a special position and a worldview, but as the one teaching methodology. She published a number of articles, participated in the leading world conferences, participates at international collaborations, and I'm always positively impressed by her scientific work, for she always addresses controversial issues with her specific view. And the choice of topics is absolutely personal. And she's a great team worker. And she's a great team builder. What I would like to do is to wish her a smooth scientific route. And today we witness a very important stage of her career. And I suppose that this is only the starting point of her scientific work and research. We can see the comprehensive research that was conducted. She, together with the academic community, understands these issues, and I hope that this will lead to further academic and professional discussion of the topics mentioned in the academic thesis. And this thesis is a rare example of great quality. Thank you. I'm sorry that I didn't mention that you had only 3 minutes to speak. Sorry. Dear colleagues, among the members of the Dissertation Council, is there anybody else who's willing to speak? Igor Nikolaevich, you wanted to speak, please. You have no more than 2 minutes. I agree with the remark that according to the law, it is necessary for mass media to indicate that the mass media is a foreign agent. But we have two aspects. We are broadcast into the network. Is it mass media? Should we remember that or not? That's the situational aspect. And the second aspect is, since we are talking about the political aspects and the political dependence of certain mass media is significant for the professional journalism culture, I believe that for the benefit of scientific purposes, it should be mentioned what FBK is in the text of the thesis, that is. No question that were received via email. Thus, we pass to the next point of the regulation. I'd like to, before summing up the results and the final voting, I would like to ask a question to the members of the Dissertation Board and the applicant. Do the members of the Council and the applicant have any comments, questions on the procedure for conducting the meeting? Vladimirkovsky Nikolaevich. No questions. Vartanova Elena Leonidovna. No questions. Gregory J. Simons, do you have any questions to the procedure?
No.
Thank you. Олежко Владимир Федорович?
Нет. И у меня, как представителя, тоже нет вопросов. Ой, прошу прощения, Ельченко Сергей Николаевич, виноват, я вот давал вам слово, а сейчас
Поэтому
не дал.
У меня есть замечание, вы лишили меня вопроса. Ну, это шутка, no.
Спасибо.
Kamilla Nigmatullina, do you have any questions or remarks? Then we move on to the next part of the procedure, voting. The time is 4:27 Moscow time. We move into the voting procedure. Prior to that, we may declare the break with a muted sound. How do you think, is it necessary to conduct this break to discuss the results? I believe that we don't need such. No. No, there is no such need. Then we continue the procedure and move into the voting. As you well know, according to procedure, the opinion of each of the member of the Dissertation Council on the question is to be voiced separately and publicly. Please check if we all can see and hear each other. I would like the curator of the defense to provide me with the turnout list. I'd like to remind you that the decision of the Dissertation Council for awarding academic degree is considered positive if more than half, at least 3 members of the Dissertation Council who participated in the meeting voted for it, in accordance with the clause 23 of the procedure. Council member Igor Blokhin, your opinion, please. The applicant deserves to be awarded. Bukov Ilya Anatolyevich. Thank you, I vote for. Council member Vartanova Elena. I vote for. Council member Gregory John Simons, your opinion, please. Council member Sergei Nikolaevich Ilchenko, your opinion. 4. Council member Oleshko Vladimir Fedorovich, your opinion. I vote for. Thank you. And I, the chairman of the Council of Vladimir Petrovich, I vote for. Counting of votes and announcement of voting results. Thus, dear colleagues and guests, I declare that out of 7 members of the Council participating in the voting of the Dissertation Council, voted for 7 people, against none, abstained none. The decision to award Kamilla Nigmatullina the scientific degree Doctor of Political Sciences, Scientific Specialty 10 Journalism is accepted. Kamilla Nigmatullina, I give you the floor for the conclusion remarks. It was all so quick. I was ready to for the discussion. I'm going to thank, well, first of all, I would like to thank my scientific advisor for our joint work in empirical analysis, for publications, for participation in conferences, and for the support in a friendly way. And as for the edge that I was on the edge a week ago. The Alliance of the Independent Regional Publishers in St. Petersburg conducted a conference within the framework of which there was a closed discussion interview of Irina Shikman, who is a blogger now, and Julia Warszawska, chief editor of Forbes Woman. And they were discussing who are bloggers and journalists, how is it linked in Russia, and throughout 90 minutes, Irina Shikova was saying that it is wrong to go to the Faculty of Journalism. And I couldn't but speak. And I proved that it is worth entering St. Petersburg State University. And she agreed that she shouldn't have mentioned that. I wanted to say that I always feel it personally when we have the discussion with colleagues, with the specialists. I feel that I have to protect the honor of the work of a journalist. A few brief words considering what led me to be here today. 21 years ago I came to the Faculty of Journalism, and I was so overwhelmed that I'm still here. I entered the faculty. I graduated from university 15 years ago, got the degree of a specialist, and there was a ball for 8 students. I remember getting the sign of the Emperor's University, and this is an honor that I still possess. 15 years have passed since then, and now I'm standing here, and I hear that now I'm awarded the degree of the Doctor of Political Sciences, and it's difficult to believe. I'd like to thank Anatoly Stepanovich, the head of the Institute at the Highest School of Journalism and Mass Communication, for support at all the stages of the research, for motivation to complete the work. I'd like to thank the Department of Digital Media Communication. Today there is one person, one representative of the department, and the representatives of the department were individual and acting individually, and took away the burden of administrative work from me when I was preparing for my thesis. I'd like to thank the editor of the work. I'd like to thank my parents, of course, who are now watching the broadcast, the friends who've been waiting for this day. When will I stop saying that I'm busy? And I'd like to thank the members of the Dissertation Council for the work done. That is a great day for me. Dear colleagues, let us congratulate Kamilla Nigmatullina from behalf of the Council, from the colleagues who are present with us now. I would like to congratulate Kamilla Nigmatullina, not with the positive defense, but with the work that she conducted. So let's thank Kamilla Nigmatullina for the defense and congratulate her.
Прежде чем я объявлю заседание закрытым, я еще хочу...
Also, I'd like to thank all the members of the Dissertation Council, and especially those who were with us in the remote access mode, which is not easy. So I'd like to especially thank Elena Leonidovna, Vladimir, to Professor Simons, of course, who is leading a specialist on Russian journalism. I'd like to congratulate a great team of the Institute High School of Journalism and Mass Communication. And I congratulate us on the anniversary of journalism. And I declare the meeting closed. Thank you all for participation. Turn off live broadcast. Thank you. Goodbye.